I'd like to introduce Bob Rubin, who I'm sure you all know. He's had a very long and pedigreed career in government service and in finance, and we have a lot of interesting things to talk about. So I'm going to open up with something that, frankly, I spend a lot of my time thinking about and asking people about. This year, we've actually seen a bit of a tentative economic boom in Asia, especially China, Europe, and the US at the same time for the first time, I think, since the immediate recovery after the crisis. And some people are optimistic that we maybe have turned the proverbial corner. Maybe I'm just sort of a pessimistic journalist, but I'm skeptical, and I'd like to hear what your thoughts are.
Well, I think the following, Robin. You're talking about the short term now? Like
short
17,
term,
18,
17,
like
18,
yeah. Okay, let's go around the world real quick. The Eurozone clearly is having a cyclical rebound of some magnitude, but my view, for whatever it's worth, is that individually the countries, particularly the troubled countries, France, Italy, even Spain, have enormously complex structural issues to deal with, though Spain's done more than the others, and Italy is the most lagging. And the politics of doing all that are going to be very difficult. There are also a lot of fiscal issues. But more broadly, Robin, my view is the following, and that is that even if these countries do some reasonable job of dealing with their own specific issues, and I'm pretty skeptical about the politics and their capacity to do that, but leaving that aside, the Eurozone itself has enormously complicated structural issues to resolve if they're going to be long-term successful with respect to bank guarantee, deposit insurance, fiscal coordination, Eurobonds, and so forth. And I think those are going to be enormously daunting challenges, and I myself would have a pretty concerned view about the longer run outlook as to where all this is going to go. China is so while there is a cyclical rebound, my instinct would be to think of that as cyclical, with a lot of issues out there. China is sort of more or less just new normal. The IMF came out with a recent growth projection, somewhere I think 6.7% or 6.5, I've forgotten. And that is sort of the new normal. But for those of you who've been in China lately, you'll know that officials in China, at least, are very focused on financial stability. And there are a lot of other issues that China faces. Demographics, obviously, because of the one-child policy, environmental issues, a whole host of other issues. My view would be that, and SOE reform, which they've actually now reversed position on, it's not even their formal objective, at least de facto, at the moment. Having said that, and I think there's a lot to be focused on, given that China's now in a different stage than it was when it came back from, when it recovered, or rather moved forward from being a poor country. But if you look at the success that China's had since 1978, my instinct is to think the probabilities are that over time they'll do what they need to do, but time will tell. And then you get the United States. And we're projected by the IMF to grow something like 2.1%. They just revised their projections the other day, probably most of you know that. 2.1% this year, 2.1% next year. There obviously are a lot of policy proposals that have been made by the president and by the House of Representatives in the area of taxes and I guess taxes and regulation, two predominant ones, and trade. So there are three areas that could affect the short term. Regulation he can do without restriction, and we'll see what he does. Hopefully he'll do this within the context of a cost-benefit framework, but my instinct is, having watched it so far, that it isn't going to be constrained in that way.
No.
Two is trade, and I think trade is a real risk. The administration has a concept about trade deficits and our nation's trade deficits, current account deficits, that are inconsistent with virtually all mainstream thinking about trade, whether it be conservative economists or liberal economists. And I think there's a real risk that in the trade area that there could be actions that could be significantly counterproductive for our economy, for consumers, and for our capacity, for our producers. Furthermore, if the president continues to be frustrated by legislative inaction or the courts or the media or whatever else frustrates him, there was always the possibility that he'll lash out in some way. And if you do that, not only are you counterproductive in the respects I've already mentioned, but there's certainly the possibility, Robin, of trade retaliation.
Yes.
And finally, it gets us to taxes. And very briefly, my view on taxes is following. There are two dimensions, there are two elements of the tax proposals. One is reform. And I think since reform always involves winners and losers, it's always been extremely difficult to do reform, and I think at least, that the reform measures are highly likely to go nowheres. And that leaves you with the tax cuts. And that remains to be seen. The schedule of tax cuts has been deferred consistently and is now being deferred again. Well, I shouldn't say now being deferred again. It looks to me, at least, that it's going to be pushed back further by all the problems around healthcare, Russia, and the like. So if we get it, my guess is you get it toward the last quarter this year or first quarter next year, if you get it.
If we get it, yeah.
And in terms of the odds of corporate tax cuts, major corporate tax cuts, I think it's very complicated to judge, but it seems to me it's kind of a 50-50 proposition. And one of the real issues that will have to be dealt with is this question. No matter how this thing is done, there aren't going to be anything remotely like the necessary pay-fors to fund it. So it's going to be funded largely by deficits. And the question is, how will the majorities in the House and the Senate respond or react when you have very large deficits being created by very large tax cuts? And remember, they're doing all this under the reconciliation process to avoid the filibuster rules. So they have to get, of the 52 Republican senators, they have to get the support of 50 plus the vice president's tie-breaking vote, which means they can only afford to lose 3 senators. And then, of course, there's the Freedom Caucus in the House, which may also have a concern, or may not have a dispositive concern about fiscal matters. So I think there's a lot of uncertainty about what will happen in the tax cut area.
Well, I want to spend most of our time on the US, obviously it's close to home, but there was just a panel here on China. I think that's fascinating. I remember reading a couple of years ago a paper by one of your former colleagues, Larry Summers, where he talked about, I think the paper was entitled Asia-Phoria Meet Reversion to Mean, which I think was fairly punchy. But he made the point that, we haven't had a lot of examples of infrastructure and construction-led growth spurts financed by credit, especially in Asia, that have ended well. And we seem to be putting a lot of faith in the Chinese authorities, which frankly have played, I think, a blinder so far. Being economies are very hard things to manage. Moving beyond the next year or two, how worried should we be? Because China's been, half of global growth in the post-crisis era? That's quite alarming if we hit a hard landing there.
Well, look, the problem and the reason that, as I say, those who've been in China recently have seen it yourself as you've met with officials. They're very focused, for the very reason you say, Robin, on financial stability. Total Chinese debt is about 300% of GDP. Well, that's not that different from the U.S., but the difference is that you got exactly the right point. The difference is a lot of this has been used to fund unsound projects that were designed to promote growth. And so you've got a lot of this that is now represents debt in unsound projects. And the question is, how will all of this work out? In addition, there's what I think of the shadow banking area, or the gray area, if you will, in the Chinese financial system, including these wealth management products. So there are a lot of very big issues they've got to deal with in the financial area, and I think the answer is, who knows? Actually, somewhat conversant with this, my instinct is to think that given they have a lot of room on the fiscal side, they have a lot of fiscal room, and given they still have substantial reserves, though they have spent them down some to maintain their currency, I think they'll work their way through this over time, but there could be some ups and downs, and it certainly is, as you correctly say, a risk.
But is the danger maybe that I find myself sometimes falling into the trap of looking at, the old EM crises of the 80s and 90s, many of which you helped clean up. Maybe this will be a different type, that it'll be more like Japan than the old Asian crisis, because they have fiscal space, because they have a lot of levers they can pull. But it's just the demographics look fairly similar to Japan. And it'll also be a messy banking sector that will take decades to clean up.
Yeah, but I think that's a good point, Robin, but I think there's a big difference. Japan basically has had roughly 25 years of very, very low growth. And you can have all kinds of discussions about why that is and everything else. Kind of interesting subject, in my opinion. But anyway, leave that aside. That's what they've had. And looking forward, it seems to me, although Japan's doing a little better at the moment, that Japan's going to be a low-growth economy, very low-growth economy. I don't think China, as a society, I think it's a very different society culturally than Japan. And I don't think that I think for China, if they fall into, which I don't think they will, but if they fall into the kind of trap that Japan is in, maybe I shouldn't call it a trap, because Japanese may not view it as a trap, but if they have conditions analogous to what happened in Japan, I'm not so sure that works politically in China. And so I think the authorities will simply have to I think the authorities will try to do everything they can to avoid that. And I think they have the capacity to avoid it, but the risk that you mentioned certainly exists. Can I go back to the U.S. for just 1 second?
Yeah.
I didn't want to leap. If we do get a large tax, I think this is a very important point to bear in mind. And by the way, I know all of you are interested in fintech, as I mentioned at the beginning. But all of you are going to be enormously affected, despite the fact that what you're focused on is financial technology and how that affects your industry, which I think the effects will be enormous. You're going to be affected by the geopolitical, the political, and the economic conditions of the world that constitute the context in which you're operating. So I think it's really, really important for everybody involved in any of these activities to have their own probabilistic judgments as to where all of this is going in the broader contextual sense, because the context will have tremendous effect on you, no matter how specifically you're focused on technology and its application to your particular activity. Go back to the United States for 1 second. If we do enact a corporate tax cut, and as I said a moment ago, it will generate huge deficits no matter what pay-fors, because I don't think there'll be much done in the way of pay-fors, and to the extent they are, it's not going to be remotely meet the needs. So then you might say, well, what effect that's going to have on growth? And I think in the shorter term, 17 and 18. And I think the answer to that is that as the Fed has said, and as most labor economists will say, and as I kind of think is probably right, we're probably very close to true full employment, no matter what you look at, the employment rate, participation rate, whatever you want to look at. If that's so, and I believe it is so, I think the odds are extremely high that it's so, let us say, then even if you have a very large stimulus, it is unlikely to produce more than moderate increase in growth. So if the projected growth rate for next year is 2.1%, maybe it goes to 2.3, 2.4, maybe. But I don't think much. The probabilities get very low when you start getting above those numbers. Yeah. So then you're going to have all this excess demand, and what's going to happen? And either it will be inflationary, which I think is unlikely, conceivable, but unlikely, or the Fed will step in and counteract that with their own policies, but that depends on what kind of people the president appoints into what are now likely to be 5 and maybe even 6 vacancies over the course of the next year, or it goes into asset prices. I think what it will not go into, or highly unlikely to go into, is raising growth above, I don't know, pick a number, 2.4%, 2.5%, something like that. And even that will only be temporary, because ultimately we have to get back to our long-term potential, which is another question we should discuss.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't look very like we'll have this Trump bump. Maybe this is me being a very cynical journalist, and it's sort of congenital to my profession. But even tax cuts looks very difficult. I mean, even Trump's budget director, Mick Mulvaney, has, he was one of the ringleaders on this. We have a debt ceiling coming up. I mean, we're talking about avoiding the debt ceiling, let alone actually managing a massive unfunded tax cut.
There's a marvelous irony, which you've just identified. The current head of OMB, when he was in the Congress, or rather in the House, was a fiscal hawk.
Yeah, ultra hawk.
Yeah, well, absolutely an ultra hawk. Now, of course, he's part of the administration that wants to do these tax cuts. Look, I don't know, Robin. If you go back, I've been around this political system for a long time, including the 6.5 years I was in our administration, but even way before that, I was pretty involved with it. This is not a criticism, it's just a comment I'm about to say. When the fiscal hawks on the Republican side have come up against the potential for doing tax cuts, they almost always revert to the tax cuts, despite their philosophical belief in sound fiscal conditions. So I kind of think, but that is going to be a real question. Another real question, which I just raised, so I'll allude to it once more, though, is the Fed, and what is the Fed going to be like? They're going to be at least 5, assuming that Janet Yellen and Stan Fischer are not reappointed to their current positions. I have no idea what he's going to do, obviously. But if he doesn't, and assuming that if they're not, they step down, and I have no idea what they're going to do, you would have anywhere from 3 to, and then there's one other possibility of, say, 3 to 5 open seats, and I actually think maybe even a 6. If he decides to put people in there who really believe in the mission of the Fed to protect price stability as well as full employment, then that obviously, they would then act to offset whatever excess demand is created. If he puts in accommodationists whose interest is in accommodating his desire for what I think are very unrealistic objectives with respect to growth, then you do run a risk. Then they don't try to counteract the excess demand, and you do run at least the risk of inflation, which is something none of us ever think about. There are a lot of reasons why you might not get that inflation, but the excess demand has to go up to someplace, and maybe it'll be asset prices. I don't know.
I mean, on tax cut, it always reminds me of St. Augustine. Lord, make me chaste, but not now. Politicians are very good at saying, well, at some point we'll tighten the belt, but it's tricky to do in practice.
St. Augustine was, of course, a very interesting figure, although his reference to that, I think, was in a different area than taxes. But
yes,
anyway.
no, I think very much so. A slightly more amusing one. But on the Fed, actually, so I remember you wrote a piece not so long ago about the dangers to the Fed's independence. I mean, we have a track record of most administrations favoring competence and continuity above political decisions. So, Obama reaffirmed Bernanke. We had Paul Volcker, that was also confirmed by Bush. How big is the danger that the Fed becomes very political? Because Yellen doesn't look, she might fit me. He's a low interest rate guy. He said so. He's the king of debt. Why would he want to put some Republican hawk in there?
The point you got to the right issue, and that's the point I was trying to make. Yeah, I had an op-ed in the New York Times about 2 or 3 months, I don't remember when it was, say a couple of months ago. And the question was exactly the one you just raised. This is a really important question with respect to our economy. What kind of people is this president going to appoint to the Fed? And I find this president a little more difficult to predict than perhaps some other people that have been in that office. So,
no, really?
Well, it's probably more reflection on me than on him. But given that one does find a touch of difficulty in predicting what he's going to do, I don't know. But based on everything he said, I think there's at least some risk that he'll put in accommodationists that won't then pursue the price stability mandate of the Fed. Look, I think Janet Yellen has done. I think she's done a very good job. But whether he will and she's not, she has leaned toward keeping rates lower than perhaps some people would have. But I think she's found the right balance myself. I have no idea whether he would consider reappointing her or not.
She seems to be tending towards the hawkish side again now.
Who would?
Yellen. She seems quite determined to normalize interest rates again.
Slowly. I have no knowledge of this, but just reading the same things you do, read the press. She does seem to be oriented.
The FT, obviously, is the best place to read about this.
Well, the FT is amongst those that I read, yes. Not always first, maybe, but nevertheless. But leaving that issue aside for the moment, no, I subscribe to it, actually, so you should be very happy.
Thank you for your support.
Oh, I do. I subscribe.
Very important to support your dead tree newspapers, guys, especially these days.
But yes, I think they are going to head toward normalization, and I think that's a responsible and reasonable thing to do.
But on inflation, one of the reasons why I've heard some people in the markets have been less enthusiastic about the Fed normalizing rates recently is that inflation has just stayed really low, even as employment has dropped. There is a participation rate issue, but that seems to be demographic. To what extent, this actually touches people in this room, I know you thought about productivity, but we seem to have a secular downshift in inflation, possibly brought on by the fact that technology. I came up with this stat that a gigabyte of storage in the 50s cost $10 million. And now it costs 3 cents. That's a staggering disinflationary force that seems to be affecting so many things. Maybe the Fed can normalize rates, but inflation will stay low, whatever.
That's certainly possible. But if there's excess demand, it has to reflect someplace. You make an interesting point about technology, though, and could I raise a slightly different point? I think there's another very major issue facing this country, and it is going to profoundly affect what all of you do for a long time to come. If you believe, and I do believe, that we've undermeasured productivity, though that's a big debate, and I think I understand, at least I have some moderate understanding of both sides of the debate, but I think we've undermeasured productivity. And I think with AI and machine learning and pattern recognition and big data and 3D printing and all the rest, I think the probabilities are high, though I know this is a big debate too. The probabilities are high. The technological development is going to powerfully affect us going forward. That can be very good for productivity, but to state the obvious, it can continue to have substantial adverse effects on wages, so you get stagnant or sluggish wage growth, at least for the bottom half of the wage spectrum, and on job insecurity. And I believe that has contributed very substantially to what is now, has been actually quite a while, a rising populism on both the left and the right in this country. It's turned against trade, as we well know, against trade liberalization, or it's heightened, let me say, the opposition to trade liberalization. I think there's some risk, Robin, that if this continues, and then I'll tell you what I think the answer is, or what the answer should be, but it's complicated, and I may be wrong also. But I think there's some risk that it could, at some point, change from focusing on trade to focusing on technological development, on market-based economics, and on labor flexibility, and that's the key to our future. Look, the answer to this is the issue is real, and we need to have is an inclusive growth agenda, at least in my opinion, that promotes both growth and broad-based participation in the benefits of growth. And I think there's a whole array of policies that could be highly constructive in achieving those two objectives. And I don't think you can get growth without broad-based participation for all kinds of reasons we could discuss if you want to. But we are not even remotely close in our political system today to pursuing an inclusive growth agenda, focusing on skills gap and infrastructure, which I don't think the president's proposal is going to happen, so how else would it happen anyway? Basic research, overcoming poverty, which is an economic issue as well, a major economic issue, major detriment to growth in this country, so much else. I don't think we're even close to pursuing these issues, to say nothing of accomplishing them. So I think, and this is the single most important thing in my own mind as I think about myself as an investor, which I am, and as a consultant to various entities, which I also am. I think the single most important factor for the future of all of us is whether or not we can reestablish effective government. We have not had an effective government in terms of meeting our challenges for an extended period of time, aside from the immediate problems that I think have made that, may have exacerbated that, but anyway, a lot. But leaving that aside, we have not had it for a long time. So the question is, can we reestablish effective government in which there's a willingness to compromise both within the Congress and also the administration, in which there's a willingness to make difficult decisions, and in which there's a focus on facts and analysis in making decisions, albeit the politics will always be involved. And that, I think, is the fundamental question with respect to the future of this country. If we can do it, I think we have tremendous comparative advantages, tremendous long-term strengths. I'd rather invest in this country than any other place in the world, or rather do business here in another place in the world. But realizing that potential depends on reestablishing effective government. I kind of think it's likely to happen for all kinds of reasons we could discuss, but certainly the current experience and empirical evidence is deeply troubling.
Yeah, I mean, I read an op-ed you wrote in October 2016, just before the election.
Yeah, that was a good op-ed.
Yes, it was,
yeah.
actually.
No,
but maybe reading it post-election, some of the recent developments, it felt you were very optimistic on America, and, you know, I love it here, among other things. Obviously, I'm not a native, as you can tell from the accent. But you said, you know, the US still has the best long-run hand in the world.
I believe that.
How high is your confidence level on that after what's been happening recently?
Well, what's happening recently, I don't find totally
or maybe
totally reassuring. Totally reassuring,
yeah.
But to put it mildly. But no, I still have the same view, Robin. I think if you, but there's a reason for it, which you may or may not agree with. I think we have tremendous comparative advantages here. Flexible labor and capital markets, demographics, natural resources, dynamic society, and so much else. Rule of law, so forth. But, and therefore I think I do think we have the best hand to play in the global economy. But it does depend on reestablishing a sound fiscal trajectory. It depends on public investment in a whole array of areas. It depends on structural reform in some of the areas I've already mentioned. Well, I didn't mention them, but K through 12 education, anything relating to the skills gap, lifelong learning, and so forth. I even think we probably should have public employment, at least on a temporary basis, so that people can get soft and hard skills to enter the workforce more effectively. And so the question is, and the ultimate issue with respect to whether or not we realize that potential is, will we reestablish effective government? And while most people I know in the political world are pretty discouraged about that, I kind of have a more positive view that we will at some point, though it may be a long and messy process. There are no guarantees. Because we do have, when you think about it, we have a long history of political resilience. We have a dynamic society, and politics changes very rapidly in America. So I think we will get there, but there's certainly no guarantees. And that is the ultimate issue, the ultimate caveat to my, yes, I do have an optimism about America, but that is the caveat of the concern.
Mm. Well, I mean, obviously, the UK seems to have committed an act of economic seppuku recently, which I'm not entirely thrilled about. But the US, I'm surprised coming over here because, you know, the European cliche about Americans, you guys are have the can-do spirit, the gung-ho attitudes, you're optimistic on the future and America being a phenomenal place. The thing that's been palpable to me, and this predates the election, is how many Americans seem really pessimistic these days. I'm constantly talking to people on the American markets, the area I cover all the time. I constantly have to tell people that the American capital markets are incredibly vibrant and dynamic, despite all the issues. Look at the IPOs. Everybody here, I'm sure, has talked about how difficult it is to go public and the IPO market is dying out. It's partially a reflection that you have this vibrant venture capital market, a private debt market that people in Europe would kill for. But why? So why are people so negative?
You know, that's a good question. And I think a part of it, Robin, and as you say, this predates the election, I think a good part of it is a reality. I think it was about a year ago, and don't hold me to this exactly, but about a year ago, the Fed put out a study, and I think these aren't exactly right numbers, but I'm in the right ballpark. Something over 30%, I think it was 31% or 35% of the American people self-describe themselves as struggling. And it said, and that same study, I think, said something like 40% or thereabouts of the American people couldn't raise $400 in cash in 24 hours. In other words, what's happened is, and I think it's largely technology, although it's blamed on globalization, and that globalization plays a role in this too. These forces that have been so powerful in terms of promoting growth have also created serious wage pressures and job dislocations for, say, the bottom half, if you will, of the American income spectrum. And so, yes, there's a lot of concern, and I think with good reason on the part of many Americans about where all this is heading. What I think, and this I think is the thing that's so troubling to me, and I really, it is a terribly troubling problem, a terribly troubling point, and that is, I think there is a way to deal with this. I really do, and that op-ed was in the Washington Post. And I thought it was pretty good. You can disagree with the specifics, but I think the basic point was kind of right, which is that there is an inclusive growth agenda which, if we put it in place, would enable us to deal with this really tectonic changes, the shifting of the tectonic plates in our economy, and I think we could do very well. But we haven't had a political system, arguably, in the 90s, that's when I was there, White House and Treasury and all that kind of stuff, there was a lot of partisanship, but we got a fair bit done on a bipartisan basis, although conditions were already worse than they'd been, say, 20 years before that in terms of bipartisanship. But now, in the last, say, 10 years or thereabouts, it really, the ability for our political system to function effectively is pretty much ground to a halt, with the exception of a few significant pieces of legislation. But predominantly, we simply have not dealt with our challenges. And I think that is disheartening to people. But as I say, I've said this before, so I'll say it again. I think the odds are, everything's about probabilities. I mean, there are no absolute answers or certainties about anything. So I'm making my judgments. You all have to make your judgments. I think the odds are we'll get back on track. But there are no guarantees, and it may be a long and messy process, Robin.
Yeah. But, I mean, inclusive growth, I mean, I don't think anybody, it's one of those phrases that sounds great and everybody agrees with it. So it's always, what does that mean in concrete practice? Because, I mean, like, it's a complex world, complex answers and questions. What does that mean? What do we do?
Boy, I'll tell you, I'll give you my view in 1 second. But it is. The issues are complex. The solutions have to be complex. And yet, for the most part, the public responds much better to bumper sticker simplicities. I was with President Clinton in the Oval Office in 1994 when he was deeply frustrated because he had done a lot that was really significant. And eventually, of course, it worked and it got him reelected, but the people weren't feeling it yet. And he said, you know, the American people want John Wayne to ride up on a white horse with a silver bullet. Now, he sort of mixed up his cowboy metaphors, but leaving that aside, well, he did. He
could have been a journalist with a mixed metaphor like that.
You couldn't be a journalist. No, wanted to be a journalist, but anyway.
Did okay, yeah.
Well, he didn't. But the point he was making, which I think is right, is that in the political and public arena, simplistic views that can be contained on bumper stickers tend to resonate. Complex policies that deal with the inherent complexity of the issues we face are very, very difficult to communicate effectively politically. And that is, I think, a very serious problem. What would you do? Here's what I do. We've got to get our fiscal house in order. If you look at the intermediate and longer-term trajectory, it is really a problem. The best way to do it, of course, let's leave the ACA debate aside, okay? We have an enormously inefficient and ineffective healthcare system. Yeah. We spend about 18% thereabouts of GDP on healthcare. A lot of the European countries spend 10%, and their outcomes are not worse than ours.
I think France is 8%, and they have better outcomes than the US on average.
Okay, well, that's even more that makes the point. So, well, they drink a lot of wine. Maybe it makes you feel better. I don't know. But anyway.
They're pretty happy when they drink.
Yeah, they're happy. They do a lot of things differently than we do, and some of them maybe aren't so bad. But anyway, be that as it may, if we could, and there are some demographic issues that we have that they don't have and so forth, but nevertheless, if we could substantially decrease that, that would solve a lot of our Medicare problem. But you've got to do that. You've got to deal with the skills gap problem, and there are all kinds of possibilities there. We've got to deal with basic research. We've got to deal with infrastructure. I believe it's imperative we overcome poverty. 20% of the American children live in poverty. Aside from the question that it's a moral outrage, think of what that means for the future of our workforce. We have vastly over-incarcerated people. criminal justice is not just a criminal justice issue, it's also an economic issue. And so we've got to deal with that more effectively. And if we do, we will greatly benefit the future economy. There's a lot we need to do. And the thing that just, every time I think about it, I get the same kind of reaction. It's a terrible situation because it's not that there aren't there aren't very useful things to do. There are. There's a tremendous amount of view. And we can debate what this thing should, what exactly this policy should be. But if you had reasonable people who were basing their issues, their views on facts analysis, and were willing to get together, conservatives and liberals could get together and move forward. The problem is we don't have that right now. But I believe, as I said before, I believe the odds are sooner or later we'll find our way back.
Well, I mean, that's a core issue that I have to admit worries me a lot. When I think it was an American engineer, was it Denning Williams, that said, "In God we trust, the rest must bring data." And it's one of my favorite quotes because, you know, that's how most people should approach things. And it feels that sort of age of rationality we had for a long period has eroded somewhat. Sometimes without even, I didn't really notice it, but the idea that, you know, we now live in this post-fact, post-truth era, you know, it goes on both sides of the political aisle, really, sometimes. Doesn't that make you question that we can move into that? That even if you had all the facts and martial facts, they just don't bite because the narrative is different? The bumper sticker says something else?
I think we are now in a very difficult period, Robin. The idea of alternative facts, for example, is simply not consonant with sound decision-making. And we are in an environment in which respect for facts and analysis has deteriorated substantially. And it's not just true in our political environment, I think it's true more broadly in our society. And therefore, I think it makes it ever the more important that for any of us, and many of you are in this position, to be engaged with institutions that stand for intellectual integrity with respect to facts and analysis. I think it's all the more important those institutions try to have whatever effect they can have on our society. But I think we do need to reestablish that respect. And as I say, I think that's part of, I do think that the probabilities are that will happen because that's inherent in my general view that I believe that we will reestablish an effective political system. But for the moment, and for now, and maybe it'll go on for some period, I think you're absolutely right. There's been a terrible deterioration in the respect for facts and analysis in the public discourse, in the political discourse, and that has to be reestablished if we're going to be effective in our political decision-making. Mm.
Well, and just to end things, I mean, we're approaching 10 years from what I call the start of the financial crisis. You know, there's a small thing that happened with some funds managed by a French bank that most people miss, but I remember was a huge thing of mine with the BNP Paribas funds. 10 years on from the crisis, Janet Yellen, the Fed chair, said yesterday that she believed that we probably wouldn't have another crisis, I assume of that scale, in our lifetime. And that sounds great, but you think, are you optimistic on that side? I mean, you've experienced a few of those in your career.
Yeah, I've been through a lot of ups and downs in the system, going back a long way. I didn't see her comment, so I'm not sure what she meant. If she meant let's not speculate on what she meant, but I'll tell you what I think. The 2008 crisis was the worst crisis in 80 years. A lot of people before the 2008 crisis saw excesses, but virtually nobody, and you can see this in the Fed minutes because this includes the Fed and virtually everybody else. There were some exceptions, but virtually everybody else saw the possibility of a mega crisis. Nor did I might add. I think virtually nobody did. If that's what she meant, I would guess the probabilities of a mega crisis are really very slight. But, you know, there are some real risks that didn't used to exist. The geopolitics, for example, there are enormous risks in the geopolitical arena, and a tremendous amount is going to depend on what happens, but also a tremendous amount is going to depend on the decision-making that our country makes with respect to these issues because of the major role we play in global geopolitics. And that depends on soundness and intellectual integrity and having a balanced and disciplined and well-informed ultimate decision-maker. And we can all have our own views on where we stand in that, but that could spark, events that are serious enough could themselves spark crises of a different type. We had a senior partner at Goldman Sachs once, John Whitehead, very, very thoughtful man. And he said, each time you're done with a crisis, you say, well, we're not going to have that again because we'll protect against it. The problem is, John said, the next crisis will come from some unanticipated place. And that is always a risk in a market-based economic and financial system. Will we have normal, normal, and normal can be pretty serious. Normal ups and downs and serious downturns at some point? Yeah, I think it's inevitably part of our system. And I think all of us, I personally right now, just as one individual, because of all the risks that I see, and I think the risks are unusually great. I think the uncertainties are unusually great, and the complexity are unusually great. I tend to have a rather cautious bias. I do have a very positive view about the United States for the long term, and I don't believe in market timing. I don't think anybody's very well. Maybe some people. I think precious few people are good at it. But I do think if you look at the risks that we face, and you look at the way our own political system at the moment is functioning, I do think it's a good time to have a sort of cautious bias in whatever one does.
Oh, okay. So you're not optimistic on that respect, then?
Well, it depends what you mean.
Yeah.
I have a very affirmative view about the long-run prospects for the United States, subject to the caveat that requires that we establish effective government. If you take a shorter-run view, I do think it is not unwise to have a somewhat cautious bias, given the geopolitical risks, the risk that we have an administration whose policy views, in some respects, strike me as having some possibly counterproductive effects. For example, trade is one example. How they react to geopolitical risks would be another. I think it heightens our risks when you see some of the kinds of responses that we've seen so far or can project. So I think that probably the markets have I may be wrong about this, but I at least think underestimated the probability, well, either overestimated the probabilities that we're going to get what they think of as constructive tax cuts and regulatory reform, or underestimated the risks we won't. Now, I know that if you look at the underlying rotations of the market, that looks like it's going out of it, but I still think there's animal spirits that relate somewhat to that. But I don't. And we also have, you made you said something which I should have picked up and didn't, I apologize. We have a debt ceiling issue coming up, and at the end of September, the government has to be funded. And while these things should go smoothly and easily, because none of these should be controversial, there are members of Congress in both parties, and there is at least one cabinet member who has said that he thinks that these events should be used for the leverage potential they provide for accomplishing other purposes. If that happens, there's always a possibility. I don't think this will happen, but there's a possibility there could be a problem around either the debt ceiling or the continuing resolution or budget resolution, whatever it's going to be, at the end of September. And that could at least create temporary complexity, though I think ultimately those things will get resolved. But even if we have a temporary problem, that could adversely affect the credibility of our political system, which is at the moment already suffering a not very good period with respect to credibility.
No. I mean, as a journalist, obviously it'd be great fun to write about an American sovereign default, but I think as a person, I think that would be a rather scary prospect.
Yeah, and it's not good for you if none of the people who subscribe to your newspaper can afford to subscribe to it anymore.
No. Well,
So you might think of it from that point of view and be a little less enthusiastic.
Yeah, I'm going to move into side business. I'll canned goods. I'll trade canned goods instead, or something like that. Bob, thanks so much. It's been really fascinating, and I hope you all enjoyed it.
Robin, thank you. Peace. It was fun. Thank you.